Hello and welcome. My name is Mindy Mandell, and today I'm going to do the final video in this series of videos on Plato's Republic. So today I'm going to look at the last part of Book 10, which includes the famous myth that is known as the myth of So what we have seen throughout this dialogue and really throughout all of Plato's work is this idea that we see the world through a veil of interpretation. And we need to tear that interpretation away so that we can know what truly is, that we can reawaken the wisdom of our soul. Remember, he says in other places that learning is really just remembering. So the idea that we have to, by taking away this interpretation, we can raise our energy so that we can function at the level of knowing and access the wisdom that our soul naturally knows. But when we see the world through interpretation, we're functioning at a lower energy, at the energy of opinion. And so last week I focused on the idea of interpretation, and one of the dangers, one of the difficulties of coming out of this world of interpretation is that we're surrounded by it. The people who raised us and our friends, our families, our coworkers, in the media, everywhere we turn, there's this interpretation pulling us away from our studies and from the life that we are seeking. And so last week that was the focus of last week's video, looking at the dangers of this interpretation. And so today what we're going to focus on is the healthy soul away from all of this interpretation. So he's going to Socrates starts off by talking about his definition of good and evil. And of course, all of our translations, as I've used throughout these videos on the Republic, are from Paul Shorey. And in this section, Socrates' interlocutor is Glaucon. And he says, "You speak of good and evil, do you not?" "I do." "Is your notion of them the same as mine?" "What is it?" "That which destroys and corrupts in every case is the evil. That which preserves and benefits is the good." And so this is an idea that we've already seen many times, this idea that unity and existence go hand in hand. In fact, unity is a precondition for existence. When something loses its unity, it loses its existence as that thing. Socrates goes on, "How about this? Do you say that there is for everything its special good and evil, as, for example, for the eyes, ophthalmia, for the entire body, disease, for grain, mildew, rotting for wood, rust for bronze and iron, and, as I say, for practically everything, its congenital evil and disease?" Okay, I want to stop here for a moment because I want to stress here a point that I've made various times throughout these videos, not just about the Republic, but all of my videos. The idea that for the Platonists, when they talk about good and evil in terms of the soul, they mean the health or lack of health of the soul. It's not good and evil in the moral sense that we tend to use it in our Judeo-Christian cultures. So, and here you can see why. It wouldn't make sense to say, for example, that a body is evil in the moral sense because it has cancer or heart disease or some such thing. It wouldn't make sense to say that grain has become evil because of mildew, but it has become unhealthy. It is bad for the body or for the grain and so on. And so it's in the sense of healthy or unhealthy that we use these words good and evil. All right, Socrates goes on. "Then when one of these evils comes to anything, does it not make the thing to which it attaches itself bad in the sense of unhealthy, bad for it? And finally disintegrate and destroy it? Of course. Then the congenital evil of each thing and its own vice destroys it. Or if that is not going to destroy it, then nothing else remains that could. For obviously the good will never destroy anything, nor yet again will that which is neutral, and neither good nor evil." Excuse me, I messed that up. And neither, let me read that again. Obviously, the good will never destroy anything, nor yet again will that which is neutral in neither good nor evil. And so here we see a principle that Socrates is going to use to apply to the soul. And you can probably already see where he's going to go with this. This is going to be another argument for the immortality of the soul. He's already given various arguments in other dialogues, such as the Phaedo. So here we're going to see him use this principle to make the case here. Well then, has not the soul something that makes it evil or unhealthy? Indeed it has. All the things that we were just now enumerating, injustice and licentiousness and cowardice and ignorance. Okay, so the opposites of all the virtues. Does any one of these things dissolve and destroy it? Just as the vice of body, which is disease, wastes and destroys it so that it no longer is a body at all. In like manner, in all the examples of which we spoke, it is the specific evil which, by attaching itself to the thing and dwelling in it with power to corrupt, reduces it to nonentity. Is not that so? Yes. Come then and consider the soul in the same way. Do injustice and other wickedness dwell in it, by their indwelling and attachment to it, corrupt and wither it, till they bring it to death and separate it from the body? And they certainly do not do that, Glaucon says. And so we see here the case that if the things that are considered the proper evil of the soul do not destroy it, then nothing will. So the soul must be immortal. Glaucon then doubles down and says, Nay, by Zeus, injustice will not appear a very terrible thing after all if it is going to be fatal to its possessor, for that would be a release from all troubles. In other words, if there is no just reward or punishment in the afterworld, then doing bad and getting away with it until the end of your life would be the best thing possible. So this is going to lead us into the myth of because that is a myth about the afterlife. But before we get there, Socrates wants to look a little more closely at what is the nature of the soul. Because up to now we have been talking about the soul in terms of its connection to the body. And that's why we needed the education to tear it away from its all of the interpretations and all of the beliefs that we pick up while in human form. But what about the soul by itself? So he says, well then, that the soul is immortal, our recent argument and our other proofs would constrain us to admit. But to know the soul's true nature, we must view it not marred by communion with the body and other miseries as we now contemplate it, but consider adequately, in the light of reason, what it is when it is purified, and then you will find it to be a far more beautiful thing, and will more clearly distinguish justice and injustice in all the matters that we have now discussed. And then he clarifies it some more. He says, though we have stated the truth of its present appearance in human form, its condition as we have now contemplated it is our vision of the soul marred by countless evils or unhealthy beliefs. We must look elsewhere, Glaucon. Where? To its love of wisdom, and we must note the things of which it has apprehensions, and the associations for which it yearns, as being itself akin to the divine and the immortal and to eternal being, and so consider what it might be if it followed the gleam unreservedly and were raised by this impulse out of the depths of the sea in which it is now sunk, and were cleansed and scraped free of the rocks and barnacles, which, because it now feasts on earth, cling to it in wild profusion of earthy and stony accretion by reason of these feastings that are accounted happy. Okay, so we have to look, if we want to look at the soul by itself, we want to look to its love of wisdom, which is its natural love when separated from the physical world. We have to look at what the soul then would fare and what it would desire, what associations it would desire. And that's very much a description of coming out of the cave. Here he's calling it the depths of the sea, but it's very much like the idea of coming out of the cave into the upper world. And if the soul were to do that, if we could see it that way, then one might see whether in its real nature it is manifold or single in its simplicity, or what is the truth about it and how. But for the present, here in this dialogue, The Republic, what we've done in this dialogue is, I think, fairly well described its sufferings or its associations, its experiences, sufferings in the sense of being passive, its sufferings and the forms it assumes in this human life of ours, the various constitutions of the soul. And now Socrates goes on to a reminder of the whole point of this discussion. Remember, he was given a challenge at the beginning to say why justice in itself is good, not just the rewards or punishments of it, its reputation of being just or unjust, but the soul itself. And so he's reminding Glaucon of that. He says, we've met all the other demands of the argument, and we've not invoked the rewards and reputes of justice, as you said Homer and Hesiod do. But we have proved that justice in itself is the best thing for the soul itself, and that the soul ought to do justice whether it possesses the ring of Gyges or not, or the helmet of Hades to boot. Most true. And remember, the ring of Gyges was that story of the ring that makes you invisible so that you can act with impunity. So he didn't invoke the rewards and reputes of having a reputation for justice. Instead, he showed that justice in itself is a healthy state of soul, and that's why it is of value in and of itself. But there were some agreements that they made, which Socrates granted at the beginning, that he doesn't actually believe. And so he's going to point that out now. He says, I granted you that the just man should seem and be thought to be unjust, and the unjust just. For you thought that even if the concealment of these things from gods and men was an impossibility in fact, nevertheless it ought to be conceded for the sake of the argument, in order that the decision might be made between absolute justice and absolute injustice. Okay, so they agreed that the just person should have the reputation of being completely unjust, and the unjust person should have the reputation of being completely just. And Socrates agreed to that for the sake of the discussion. However, it doesn't strike him as truly believable. Then will not the first of these restorations be that the gods certainly are not unaware of the true character of each of the two, the just and the unjust? And Glaucon agrees that we will restore that. So the gods know the true nature of our soul. And that brings us into the myth of So here's a story of a warrior who was said to have been killed in battle, but the survivors of that battle were not able to clear the bodies away for 12 days. And you can imagine that the bodies were starting to decompose. But body had not decomposed. And 2 days later, when his body was put on the funeral pyre to burn, he awoke and he said, hold on, I'm not dead. Don't burn me yet here. And he gave them a story. He explained why he seemed to have been dead for 14 days. He says that actually he did die and he did go to the afterworld, but when he got there, he was told that he was going to be a messenger. He was going to be sent back, and it was his job to tell humanity the story of what happens to our souls when we die. And so this myth is his story. He says that he traveled to a place that he calls just a mysterious region. And there were 2 openings above, 2 openings below. And there were judges in this region who judged each of the souls and sent them to their proper place. Some went up and some went down. And then in a little bit of time, through the other 2 holes, souls returned from the journey either below or above. And they traveled to a little meadow where they can all meet together. People who, some seeing friends and loved ones, some had been above, some had been below, so they were separated. They can all get together and compare stories. And they told their stories to one another, the one lamenting and wailing as they recalled how many and how dreadful things they had suffered and seen in their journey beneath the earth. It lasted 1,000 years. While those from heaven related their delights and visions of a beauty beyond words. Also tells us that if anyone had been the cause of many deaths, or had betrayed cities and armies and reduced them to slavery, or had been participant in any other iniquity, they might receive in requital pains tenfold for each of those wrongs. And again, if any had done deeds of kindness and been just and holy men, they might receive their due reward in the same measure. And so here we see in the myth form the idea that those who are tyrants in reality, not just having a tyrannical nature, but who truly have the power to do bad things to other people, to hurt others in great numbers, they are going to suffer the most because they have the power to do the most bad. And then equal reward for those who do good. Also, just as a side note here, that throughout Plato's dialogues, the idea of slavery is always something that's a little uncomfortable for us. And Socrates never openly criticizes the system, but we do see here the idea that reducing people to slavery is considered an iniquity. Eventually, these souls get to a very mystical place described in very beautiful language, very colorful. There's this spindle that runs through the entire universe, and there are these orbs spinning, which are generally understood to be the planets of our solar system. They're each assigned a different color and a different speed at which they turn. Some turn clockwise, some counterclockwise. And this spindle is called the spindle of necessity. And the spindle turned on the knees of necessity. And up above on each of the rims of the circles, a siren stood, borne around in its revolution, and uttering one sound, one note. And from all the 8, there was a concord of a single harmony. And so you see necessity sitting on her throne at the top of the picture, and then there are her daughters at the bottom. There were 3 others who sat round at equal intervals, each one on her throne, the Fates, daughters of necessity, clad in white, who sang in unison with the music of the sirens, Lachesis and Clotho and Atropos, who sang in unison with the music of the sirens. Lachesis was singing the things that were, so she represents the past. Clotho, the things that are, so she represents the present, and Atropos represents the future, the things that are to be. And Clotho, with the touch of her right hand, helped to turn the outer circumference of the spindle, pausing from time to time. Atropos, with her left hand in like manner, helped to turn the inner circles, and Lachesis alternately with either hand lent a hand to each. And this is the word of Lachesis, the maiden daughter of necessity. Souls that live for a day, now is the beginning of another cycle of mortal generation, where birth is the beacon of death. No divinity shall cast lots for you, but you shall choose your own deity. Let him to whom falls the first lot first select the life to which he shall cleave of necessity. But virtue has no master over her, and each shall have more or less of her as he honors her or does her despite. The blame is his who chooses. God is blameless. Okay, so first they're going to choose lots, and then those lots are going to decide the order in which they can choose their next life. And that next life is chosen according to their own judgment. And so it's based on their own wisdom. And that's the idea behind God is blameless. So saying, the prophet flung the lots out among them all, and each took up the lot that fell by his side, except for our friend who was not permitted to do so. And whoever took up a lot saw plainly what number he had drawn. And after this again, the prophet placed the patterns of lives before them on the ground, far more numerous than the assembly. They were of every variety, for there were lives of all kinds of animals and all sorts of human lives, and there's a great long description here of all the various combinations. Here's the important point, though. But there was no determination of the quality of soul, because the choice of a different life inevitably determined a different character. But all other things were commingled with one another, and with wealth and poverty and sickness and health and the intermediate conditions. And so the point here is that we bring to our lives the quality of soul, the character. So whether you're born into wealth or poverty, whether your body is sickly or strong and healthy, whether you're born into a war-torn country or a peaceful country, whether your society considers you beautiful or not so beautiful, still you determine the quality of your life. I mean, obviously, some lifestyles are going to be more comfortable than others, but as for the health of your soul and the quality of your life, that is something that we each bring to our own life. And then we get to this very long passage. It's going to take a number of screens here, but this is really the moral of the story. And so I want to give this to you in whole. This is what Socrates is saying to his friend Glaucon. He says, "And there, dear Glaucon, it appears, is the supreme hazard for a person. And this is the chief reason why it should be our main concern that each of us, neglecting all other studies, should seek after and study this thing, if in any way he may be able to learn of and discover the person who will give him the ability and the knowledge to distinguish the life that is good from that which is bad, and always and everywhere to choose the best that the conditions allow. And taking into account all the things of which we have spoken, and estimating the effect on the goodness of his life of their conjunction or their severance, to know how beauty commingled with poverty or wealth, and combined with what habit of soul, operates for good or for evil, and what are the effects of high and low birth, and private station and office, and strength and weakness, and quickness of apprehension and dullness, and all similar natural and acquired habits of the soul, when blended and combined with one another, so that the consideration of all these things he will be able to make a reasoned choice between the better and the worse life, with his eyes fixed on the nature of his soul, naming the worse life that which will tend to make it more unjust, and the better life is that which will make it more just. But all other considerations he will dismiss, for we have seen that this is the best choice, both for life and for death." There is one more screen to look at for this quote, but before I do, I just want to stress this part here about how you determine the worse life and the better life. It has nothing to do with wealth or beauty or reputation. It has everything to do with the health of the soul. The just soul is the healthy soul. The unjust soul is the unhealthy soul. And so when you're looking at these various combinations, all you're thinking about is, will this be conducive to a healthy soul? And he ends this quote with this part: "And a man must take with him to the house of death and adamantine faith in this, that even there he may be undazzled by riches and similar trumpery, and may not precipitate himself into tyrannies and similar doings, and so work many evils past cure, and suffer still greater himself, but may know how always to choose in such things the life that is seated in the mean, and shun the excess in either direction, both in this world so far as may be, and in all the life to come. For this is the greatest happiness for man." Okay, so that is the moral of the story. It's not, though, the end of the myth, because from here, then Socrates describes people choosing their next life. And it's very clear from the description that people choose according to their own nature and their level of wisdom and their experiences in their past life. And he mentions a person who chose to become a tyrant because of the power and the wealth and all of the glamour of it, and at least initially. But then after this person chose, once he had a chance to look more carefully, he realized that there would be great misery at the end of his life, and he greatly regretted the choice. And here's what Socrates says about it. He did not blame himself for his woes, but fortune and the gods and anything except himself. He was one of those who had come down from heaven, a man who had lived in a well-ordered polity in his former existence, participating in virtue by habit and not by philosophy. And one may perhaps say that a majority of those who were thus caught were of the company that had come from heaven, inasmuch as they were unexercised in suffering. And so here we see a key difference between wisdom traditions and more popular versions of various religions, because there's no, rather than just following certain rules and being good by habit, what Plato is saying here is that we need to have an understanding of why the rules are right. It's not saying that the way people live according to popular religions is that the rules are not correct, that the teachings are wrong necessarily, but rather that we have to have an understanding of why, and not just have a belief in something, but to have understanding and then ultimately knowing about what is the true nature of reality and how to live in line with that. And so that's also the difference between the common understanding of temperance and the way Socrates presented it here in this dialogue. Because if you are simply following rules, then you're going to have that like angel and devil on your shoulders fighting it out sometimes. But if you have a true knowledge of the nature of reality, then doing what is naturally healthy for the soul is just going to be a very easy choice. And so you're going to be good by philosophy and not just by habit. And then the souls come eventually to the river of Lethe, the goddess of forgetfulness. So necessity and her daughters then seal the fate of the life that each of these souls chose, whether they were pleased with their choice or not. And then the souls are brought to this river where they have to take a drink so that they forget everything in the past and they're able to be reborn. And of course, our messenger was not allowed to drink so that he could come back and tell us the story. And then the entire dialogue ends with Socrates saying these words to Glaucon. And so, Glaucon, the tale was saved because did not drink from the river. And as the saying is, and it was not lost. And it will save us if we believe it, and we shall safely cross the river of Lethe and keep our soul unspotted from the world. But if we are guided by me, we shall believe that the soul is immortal and capable of enduring all extremes of good and evil. And so we shall hold ever to the upward way and pursue righteousness with wisdom always and ever, that we may be dear to ourselves and to the gods, both during our sojourn here and when we receive our reward, as the victors in the games go about to gather in theirs. And thus both here and in that journey of 1,000 years, whereof I have told you, we shall fare well. And that brings us to the end of Plato's Republic. So I do hope that you found that helpful and enjoyable, and if you did, I hope that you will give it a like, and also please think about subscribing if you don't already. I do put out a new video each week. Next week, I'm going to round out the middle dialogues with one called Menexenus. So I do hope that you will join me then. Thank you very much.